welcome to the Patient Engagement Open Forum session entitled The Fusion of Patient Engagement and Patient Experience Data, Strengthening Global Focus and Stakeholder Convergence. Just as a reminder, this meeting is going to be recorded. We can move to the next slide, please. My name is Haley Chapman, and I am a program manager with Patient-Focused Medicines Development. I'll be your moderator today, and I'm really looking forward to this great session. Move to the next slide, please. For those of you who attended perhaps our earlier session today or have attended an open forum session in the past, welcome back, and we're certainly glad to have your participation. For those of you who are new, we welcome you to this global multi-stakeholder event where we aim to provide a holistic perspective of patient engagement. We'll have several presentations followed by a co-creation session where there's time for you to share ideas and your inputs as well too. If we go through a couple of housekeeping items just before we get started, we ask you to be present and engaged so that we can make this workshop interesting together collectively and collaboratively. As you will have seen, that microphones are muted. But if you have questions or if you have some comments, please feel free to provide those in the chat or in the Q&A function for the webinar as well too. You'll see on the next slide where we've illustrated that you can answer or put in your questions within the Q&A function on Zoom. And as mentioned, if you want to connect with other people through chat, please feel free to do so. Or if you have other resources or supports that you think would be relevant for the participants to view on this, then again, please feel free to share that as well too. So moving right into our session then, we have an excellent panel of speakers with us today, and I'll just ask each of them to take a few minutes to introduce themselves and to also address a really important question, and that would be, why do you think that patient engagement and patient experience data and the fusion of the two of those is so important? So Neil, I'll turn it over to you and welcome to the session.
Thanks very much. And thank you to the Patient Engagement Open Forum for inviting me here. My involvement is with HTA and particularly through the HTAI Scientific Society. So I'll be bringing that perspective through today as well. And to answer your question, Haley, I think if we look historically at things like patient-reported outcomes, we see that it's perfectly possible to create patient-reported outcomes that are valid, but are not asking meaningful questions. We hear that from the patient community all the time, and that's a warning signal to us all that we need to be thinking about patient engagement alongside patient experience data. Thanks.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Neil. Really looking forward to your presentation and insights as well. Teresa.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm very happy to be here. Teresa Mullen. I'm the Associate Director for Strategic Initiatives in the FDA Center for Drugs. And to this question of fusion, I think the fusion of these things is important to capture what is being shared in patient engagement in the form of patient experience data so that it's available for use for decision makers after the event of engagement. And I look forward to the rest of the session. I'll turn it over back to you, Haley.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Teresa. And we look forward to hearing your perspective as well from a regulatory lens. Becky, can I turn it over to you, please?
Certainly. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all. I'm very pleased to be here today to share highlights of the achievements and outputs from the IMI Prefer project. I'm most interested in this fusion because I believe this is the pathway to having and being able to make more impactful decisions when it comes to drug development and the approval of medicines. So thank you, Haley.
Great. Thanks, Becky. And we look forward to hearing more about the tremendous work of IMI Prefer as well, too, in terms of patient preference studies and of them being one example of patient experience data. Eleanor.
Thanks, Haley, and hello to everyone. I'm here today actually representing the National Health Council. Even though I am not fully employed by them anymore, I still do some work for them. And I'm going to talk about a project that the National Health Council has been working on for the last several years that really is the culmination of this discussion of fusion between patient experience data and patient engagement. I think it's I think the fusion is a natural one. They're already fused. You cannot have patient experience data if no patient engagement has taken place. They are inextricably interwoven. You can't separate them. And I think that that's what we're going to talk more about today.
Absolutely. Terrific, Eleanor. Thank you so much. And welcome to all of the panelists as well. Really looking forward to hearing your presentations and having further conversation about this important topic as well. You'll see on the next slide that each of the panelists will have 10 minutes to present on their various topics. We'll follow that by a 10-minute Q&A, where again, we encourage you to provide your comments and questions in the Q&A or in the chat. We'll then have about half an hour or so for some insight gathering and some co-creation around some of the topics that we'll address today as well. And we'll close it out, hopefully pretty close to the 90-minute mark. So we're looking forward to a great session. On the next slide, you'll see one of the platforms that we will be using. Many of you may be familiar with GroupMap, and particularly those that have participated in an open forum session previously. We recommend that you use a computer to access GroupMap, and when prompted, you will see the link for the link for Zoom posted in the chat. You follow the link, you'll be asked for your email address, and then follow through the next steps. So we'll give that a try now. As we move to the next slide, you'll see we'd really like to have a better understanding in terms of our audience and who's participating with us today. And so thank you, Daniela. She's posted the link for the GroupMap in the chat. If you could follow that link, we will be operating Zoom and GroupMap simultaneously, but if each of you could follow the link for GroupMap, enter in your email address, and you'll see the first question is just if you could select the appropriate stakeholder group that you're here representing today. We'll just give you a minute or so to follow through with that. I see lots of people joining, which is terrific. And we will leave this particular question open as we proceed with the presentation. So if you're late joining in, feel free to hop onto GroupMap and to add in your respective response there. Wonderful. And so in the interest of time, if we can just see the results so that we can get an indication as to who's with us today, that would be great. Wonderful. So we can see that we have strong representation, obviously from industry and also from the patient community as well. Number of researchers in terms of investigators and academic researchers, and also some CROs and also caregivers. Terrific. Wonderful, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining. Again, please feel free to update this particular question as we proceed. So now we know a little bit more about the panelists. We know a little bit more about who's in our audience. I'd like to jump right in and start talking about our topic today before I turn it over to Neil, our first presenter. So if we can go to the, thank you, to the next slide. That would be great. Thank you. So as many of you know, patient engagement has really evolved over an extended period of time, especially over the last 25 to 30 years, with a number of different organizations and a variety of initiatives and activities taking place. This has continued on somewhat of a linear path until more recently, when there has been a great acceleration and increased attention paid to patient experiences, patient experience data, particularly by the regulatory and payers as well too. But given this increasing stakeholder interest, what we're starting to see is stakeholders who are looking at ways to actually work together and think about the collective value of patient engagement and patient experience data. And this really is an anticipation to make sure that the ecosystem does not become fragmented or siloed in space around patient engagement and patient experience data. We want to make sure that stakeholders are collaborating and working together to avoid duplication or inefficiencies within the healthcare system. And first and foremost, obviously as well too, to ensure that there's not increased burden on patients if stakeholders don't align and collaborate on patient engagement and patient experience data. So our aim today is really to consider this concept and the value of patient engagement, patient experience data fusion, where stakeholders can converge and focus on what is really important to patients, family members, caregivers, in order to support evidence generation, decision-making, and ultimately better health outcomes for patients. So I'd like to turn it over to Neil now, and who will provide a little bit more information around this concept of P and PED fusion, and also talk a bit more about PFMD's initiatives and efforts towards streamlining and harmonizing patient engagement and patient experience data. So welcome, Neil, and thanks very much for your contributions today.
Oh, thanks very much, Hayley. And I'm just reflecting on the slide that Hayley has just shown before we get into the presentation. I mean, that slide is a snapshot. It shows you some of the activities, a small subset of the activities in patient engagement and patient experience data. And so when we think through that and we think, hey, all these different stakeholders are working together, but also potentially divergently on patient experience data and patient engagement, there's a real danger here around duplication and fragmentation. And I think it's really important that as we think through the concepts of patient engagement and patient experience data, that we're doing that in a way that pulls stakeholders together. So you go to the next slide, please. So one clear example of this, you may have seen this before, but on the left-hand side, you can see how, in this case, the FDA described the domains of patient-relevant information that could be captured by patient experience data. On the right hand of this slide, you can see the typical questions that a health technology assessment agency will ask of patient organizations during the assessment process of a medicine. I won't go through the details on this slide, but they're basically a one-for-one match. So that's telling us that whether you're a regulator or you're a HTA body, the kinds of patient-relevant insights and information that you're looking for is very similar, if not identical. If you go on to the next slide, please. And I want to take this a step further. This is that same slide, but made more simple. Because what I really want to focus on here is, on one side, we're talking about the potential for patient experience data. And on the other side, we're talking about practices already in use by health technology assessment agencies. And I can tell you that one of the main ways they get these insights is through patient engagement. And so this begs a really important question that I think we've all been grappling with. As we get more patient experience data, that tick carries on going up that Hayley showed earlier on her slide, does that mean that we need less patient engagement? If you go to the next slide, please. The answer is categorically no. Actually, as we generate more patient experience data, it actually means that we need more patient engagement, and I'll explain why. If you look at the top half of this diagram here, this is really about the patient experience and patient engagement fusion. The top part of this diagram shows that one of the reasons we have patient engagement in decision-making processes is to ensure that patients are participating in those decision-making processes. Now, patient experience data does not replace that need. We still need patients to be participating in decision-making processes. And that's really important, because what we find is that the patient community can give us context around all of the evidence around healthcare. So the clinical evidence, the economic evidence, not just the patient experience data. And we need that context to be provided by patients and patient organizations who are participants in the decision-making process. If we go to the bottom half of that slide, when we think purely about patient experience data, we need to make sure that we're generating patient experience data that's focused on topics that are meaningful to patients. That means we need patient engagement always in the generation and co-design of patient experience data. Are we asking the right questions? Is this focused on areas of real need for the patient community? So as we generate more patient experience data, we still need to contextualize decision-making processes with patient engagement and patient engagement in the development of patient experience data. If you go to the next slide, please. And the way we've been thinking about that is, this could get really complicated, but actually it's really simple when you think it through. This all starts with real patient experiences. This is what patients or a patient or a group of patients have experienced. And these patient experiences, you can think of them like atoms of information. So they're the indivisible blocks of knowledge about what patients experience. And that experience is valid no matter whether it's a regulator looking at that experience, or it's a HTA body, or it's a healthcare system, or a clinician looking at that information. That experience is what it is. It's what the patient has experienced. And actually, that experience is still just as important and valid, no matter which method has been used to capture that experience. It doesn't matter whether that's been captured via a patient preference study, or a patient-reported outcome, or an interview, or a survey. What matters is that it's captured that experience, and that experience is then shared within patient experience data. If you go to the next slide, please. And so the way that we think this through is, if you go to the next slide as well, please, is we start with these green dots at the top. They are the real patient experiences. That's what patients are experiencing day after day after day. We need patient engagement to help us understand and contextualize those experiences and help us shape what patient experience data can be captured from those experiences. So that's the first level of patient engagement fused with patient experience data. If you go to the next slide, please. And actually, across different parts of the medicine life cycle, we can use that patient experience data multiple times for multiple different purposes across that life cycle. And Diana, if you can click 2 more, please, as well. We can do that for devices, we can do that for healthcare systems as we evolve healthcare systems, and more. If you click 1 more time, please. And as we go through all of these different medicine life cycle or device life cycle, we still need that patient engagement in the processes, in decision-making processes, and actually as co-creation partners as we go along there. And that patient engagement also identifies where we've got missing pieces of information. This feedback loop on the right-hand side is saying through patient engagement, we identify where the gaps are. Next slide, please. And it's really important, you know, we've been working this in the project that I work on with PFMD. It's really important that we have multiple stakeholders represented as we're thinking through these kinds of concepts. And this is an example of the partners that we have working with us on patient experience data and patient engagement projects within this PFMD work stream that Haley was mentioning and that I am one of the co-leads of. And if you go to the next slide, please. I'm just talking about that work stream. It's actually multiple elements coming together. Last year, we really focused on capturing what's currently happening. And so that was a paper which we call the Fast Evolving Landscape paper, to say amongst regulatory and health technology assessment stakeholders, what's currently happening? What are those new initiatives that we need to be aware of? Alongside that, we had 2 work streams running in parallel. One was about this pulling together the rationale of why different stakeholders need to be aligning around patient experience data and patient engagement, and what the value, collective value of that is for those different stakeholders. In parallel to that was the taxonomy, which I'll talk you through in a moment. On all of that, you've seen from the previous slide, we have a multi-stakeholder involvement in all of these projects, and a global multi-stakeholder steering committee that's really advising and making sure that we've got different perspectives, different stakeholders working together. Next slide, please. I'm just going to quickly go through the taxonomy, which is one of those work streams. What that's looking at is it's looking at the current situation, and it's saying, okay, we need to start with what is important to patients. What are those impacts, those pieces of information that we need to start capturing in patient experience data? And it looks at what approaches and methods are available that help us measure and capture those particular impacts. Then it asks the question of who. Okay, we've got that information now. Who are the stakeholders who are going to be using these, and when are they going to be using them, and for what purpose? So it pulls all of that together. And on the next slide, please. And what's going to come out of this, it's nearly at the end now, it's nearly ready, is an introductory guide talking you through how to use this taxonomy a glossary of terms, so everyone's aligned on what this different terminology means, and various maps that you can see on the right-hand side of this that links the what and the how and the who and the when. So we can start to sort of build frameworks of how we're going to use patient experience data with different stakeholders and for what purposes. Next slide, please. And moving forward, one of the things that we're really working on now is pulling all of that great work and building into a roadmap. So the key element on here is the red box that you can see, which is, okay, now we have this knowledge about the collective value, we have the taxonomy, we have our collaborations with prefer looking at particularly at patient preference studies, and how do we pull all this into something that actually delivers outcomes for the community? Last slide, please. And the way we're looking at this is to say, okay, we're still working this out, but there are various outcomes that are possible from pulling all this information together. We could build navigational tools for patient experience data. We could build maps that help us navigate different phases of medicine's development, those kinds of things, and think about the different stakeholders involved that we need to be giving data to. We could follow the patient pathway here and say, okay, what's all the different pieces of data and stakeholders along that patient pathway? And ultimately, could we even be having a repository of patient experience data related to a particular disease, for example, that pulls all of these different sources of data together so we avoid that duplication? And that is my last slide now. So thank you very much. I'm going to pass straight on to Teresa.
Thank you, Neil. And so I'm going to also be talking about using patient engagement with patient experience data, and really to from a regulatory standpoint. So thinking about regulatory decision making and trying to capture that information to inform decisions. Next slide, please. And so you can go to the next slide. That's just repeating. And so some of the themes of my talk today are going to be about the value of capturing that information. Some of the themes that Neil was touching on are, I think, kind of resonant or repeated here. So specific disease contexts, standardizing the format of it, again, to make it more easily accessible and understandable by all the potential users, and data quality, very important, and give some examples of ways that information is being captured and trying to create standardization for this, and so that we can ensure good quality of information and make tools available for downstream use. So next slide, please. And so as a regulator, I mean, FDA's one of our primary goals in hearing from patients living with their disease is to inform our decision making. So the kinds of questions, and I think this was covered a little bit before, that we ask in these meetings, in our engagements with patient groups are, what symptoms have the most impact on your daily life? That specific activities, what is your current treatment regimen and that you're following, and how well is that working? What do you take into account when you're making decisions about choosing a treatment? And many other questions, but these are really key basic questions, and this does really help inform our decision making. Next slide, please. And so we try to capture this information. We have meeting reports, but one of the ways that we collect this information, a sort of formal approach, is the patient-focused drug development meetings. And from these meetings, we produce, and patient groups produce, a so-called Voice of the Patient report, which we have a fairly standard structure for. FDA has so far conducted 30 of these types of meetings, and patient-led meetings are now, we've had more than 55, and all of them, each has been in a different disease area. Each of these meetings has explored those questions I covered on that previous slide, where we're hearing from patients and families about their experience with the disease and the treatments that have been available. The underlined words here are links to those repositories on FDA's website. We provide a list of links to the patient documents on their websites, but we try to have one place where this is all available so that it's easy to find these reports and refer to them after the meeting. I've heard from many of our drug reviewers that being in these meetings and hearing the patients perspective has influenced how they've been able to look at applications that come in later for indications in that disease area, and they're able to refer to these reports. So they really have, it's valuable to have captured that information for later use. Next slide, please. So patient experience data is a term that's going to be used a lot in this session today, and the US law actually defines, provides FDA at least with a definition for patient experience data. And so it can be collected, it covers a wide range of potential formats that you can see. And so it's really can be very qualitative narrative reports like these voice of the patient reports all the way to a clinical outcome assessment collected in a clinical trial. So that's a really wide range. Next slide, please. And so quality really matters. The information, the quality of that data that's collected will determine the extent to which it can be used in regulatory decision-making. We're developing a series of guidance on this, guidance to industry and other stakeholders to help improve and enhance the quality to enhance usability. Next slide, please. And here's one of the guidances I want to draw attention to. It's titled Collecting Comprehensive and Representative Patient Input. That is also a link you can follow. And this discusses the methods that can be used to collect patient input, patient experience information, and also the relationship between the research question you're trying to answer, what are you trying to find out, and the methods that would be most appropriate to try to get that information. Next slide, please. Another guidance I want to point to is the methods to identify what's important to patients. This was recently put out in final form. Again, that's the link. And this discusses methods for trying to collect and understand what aspects or symptoms that matter to patients, and the methods for best trying to conduct those interviews, the interview guides, and so on, and also how to avoid asking leading questions or essentially getting misleading information or that poorly represents what is actually important to the patient. So again, affecting quality. Next slide, please. We have two more guidances that we're working on, and the titles are there. And these really start to move into more of the collection of patient experience data in clinical trials in the form of clinical outcome assessments. And so that gets to a more kind of a quantitative or sort of tool and measurement oriented approach. So they'll be forthcoming in the next year or so. And the next slide, please. We also want to say that the measures that are going to be valid and reliable for regulatory decision-making really could help downstream decision makers, as Neil was talking about. And so we need to, FDA needs to distinguish measures that are about improvement of a therapy that you could attribute to the therapy from other factors that might affect how someone feels and functions. We need that kind of information. Regulators need it. And so if we can use these tools, they may be of use downstream as well. Next slide, please. And so we have a standard core clinical outcome assessment grant program underway. And right now we have 5 grants pursuing migraine, acute pain in infants and young children, physical functioning across a range of disease areas, measures of fluid overflow for nephrotic syndrome and communication ability, and that's really relevant to rare diseases. Next slide, please. And what we find, based on our experience to date with these grant programs, is that they're really producing what we think will be very good measures, but it's very staff intensive to do this. And so the pace at which we can go at and the scale of this is limited by the resource requirements for it. But we are focusing now more on domains within disease areas that can be applicable to more than one disease. There are some examples of swallowing and speech, for example, physical functioning, that be applicable to a range of rare diseases, for example, and where we have a lot of unmet need. Next slide, please. So I just want to conclude with this, which is that, health decision makers, we need to engage patients to understand what they've gone through in their experiences. We urge our the companies that we regulate and patient groups to plan carefully how you collect this information so we can maximize its use after it's collected, and that disease-specific information and tools really would help with that downstream use. And now I'm going to turn it over to Becky, who's going to talk about collaborative work being done to support rigorous approaches for patient preference data collection. So over to you, Becky.
Perfect. Thank you, Teresa. Next slide, please. And the next one. All right, so today what I'd like to focus on is providing really sort of a foundational background, understanding the science of benefit risk assessment and the science of patient preference studies. We're going to cover just at a very high level what preference studies are and aren't, how patient preference information can be used, and what we need in order to be able to trust and use patient preference information. We'll also briefly take a look at some of the aims and achievements and highlights from the IMI Prefer project, and then a little bit about what might come next. So next slide, please. This is information, if you've been to some of these presentations before, you may have seen myself or others cover. But it really provides sort of an important background and an important context to understanding benefit risk assessment and patient preference information studies. So as Teresa could certainly point out much better than myself, both in drug development and in regulatory review, we really are guided by one overarching fundamental question. And for us, that fundamental question is, do the benefits of a medication or a device exceed the risks for the indication in the expected population? Next slide, please. And in order to help us make that decision as to whether the benefits outweigh the risks, we use a process that we refer to as structured decision-making or structured benefit risk assessment. You can approach structured benefit risk from a variety of perspectives, but when you boil them all down and you look at them, they all share a core set of principles and of thought and of processes. And the visual that you see at the top of the slide really lays out the core elements of a structured benefit risk assessment. And that is, we're looking at the decision that needs to be made. We're identifying key benefits and key risks. We're then collecting, integrating, and summarizing the data associated with those key benefits and risks. And then we want to interpret the data to help develop a benefit risk profile. So we're continually asking ourselves across the life cycle of drug development, do the benefits outweigh the risks? But in the context of asking ourselves, do the benefits outweigh the risks? We also need to understand how the values and preferences of patients can inform the ascertainment of the benefit risk profile. Next slide, please. So really, in addition to this core principle of drug development, of asking ourselves, do the benefits outweigh the risks? That principle, that thought, coexists with a second guiding principle. And that second guiding principle is that patients who are living with a disease are really experts on the impacts of the disease and the desired treatment goals and outcomes. Something I think which you heard both Neil and Teresa highlight. Next slide, please. So I've said repeatedly now, multiple times, I've used the phrase patient preference information, patient preference studies. So what are patient preference studies? What is patient preference information? Well, patient preference information is one type of patient experience data. Patient preference information really captures the value that patients place on various aspects of a drug or a device. And patient preference information can account for the differing patient perspectives on the benefits and risks, and really help us understand what matters to patients and what matters most. So what matters to patients and how much does it matter? Next slide, please. So this is a slide. The next couple of slides you'll see are courtesy of Brett Halber, who's now with Pfizer. But Brett really has done a wonderful job of describing what are patient preference studies, what's patient preference sensitive, what are patient preference sensitive decisions, and really does a nice job of describing this area of data and this area of research. So he was kind enough to loan me a couple of slides. And we look to develop patient preference information when we find ourselves with preference sensitive decisions. So what are preference sensitive decisions? Those are situations or decisions in which there are multiple treatment options, and the decision as to which option to pursue depends upon the preferences of the decision maker, in this case, the patient. Preference sensitive decisions occur when there are multiple treatment options and no one option seems to be obviously better or significantly much better. And when there's a degree or a significant degree of ambiguity or uncertainty as to which option might be better. Next slide, please. So, but what does that really mean, right? So, you know, I've thrown around maybe sort of an alphabet soup of terms. And it still might not be clear what is patient preference information, or when do we need it, or how do we use it? Well, really, we can think about patient preference information in terms of having three types or three categories. Patient preference information, when we're seeking to develop it, we can be seeking to learn more about something we refer to as attributes. And attributes are really features that help us understand what matters most to patients. And we can usually develop that information through what we refer to as simple quantitative methods that help us understand, categorize, contextualize those features or attributes. There's also patient preference information that can be developed to help us understand the relative importance of attributes. So when we're doing patient preference studies that focus on relative importance, those studies help us understand how much something matters to patients. And then the third set of patient preference studies that we can do may focus on what we refer to as trade-offs. And trade-offs help us understand not only how much it matters to patients, but what patients might be willing to get or give up in order to achieve a desired outcome. So next slide, please. So when we think of patient preference studies, not only can we think of them in terms of the types of information they allow us to develop, but you can also see how they might increase in complexity as we move from one type of preference information to another. Next slide, please. So it's important just to remember that patient preference studies and patient preference information really focus on the relative desirability or acceptability of the attributes of a treatment, and they are not a type of patient-reported outcome. Next slide, please. All right, so in the interest of time, I'm obviously not going to walk through this slide in significant detail, but the purpose of this slide is to really highlight how patient preference information can be used across the life cycle of drug development to inform each and every one of these various development time points. Next slide, please. So what's needed for us to be able to use patient preference information in a robust and routine way? Well, we need patient preference information to be of high quality, for it to be representative of the patient population that we're developing the preferences in, and we need it to be reliable and valid. Next slide, please. So how do we do that? For the past 5 years, there's been a public-private partnership called PREFER, and PREFER has really worked to develop and understand exactly these issues. How do we develop high-quality patient preference information? How do we develop representative patient preference information? And how and when can we validly and reliably use that information? Next slide, please. This is a slide that really highlights the aims and achievements of 5 years worth of work. On the right-hand side, you can see some of the significant outputs from PREFER. One is that in partnership with the European Medicines Agency, we're on the cusp of achieving what's called a qualification. And a qualification really means that a company can submit a new drug application using an approach and methods that the EMA recognizes and accepts and endorses. So we're on the verge of having a positive qualification opinion for the use of a patient preference framework and a select catalog of methods. Here in the next few weeks, we'll be releasing our recommendations, which really address these issues that I talked about: quality, representativeness, validity, and reliability. And then, as you saw in one of the previous slides, we have a roadmap that shows how preference information can be used across the life cycle. So next slide, please. And I believe this is the last slide that I have. So what I wanted to highlight is that at the end of the month, April 28th, we're having an event in which we're walking through that set of recommendations. It's an open meeting, so anybody who's interested is welcome to attend. So we would invite you to join us on April 28th to learn more about this suite of recommendations we have around how to, around what are the best practices for developing and using patient preference information. So thank you, everybody, for your time this morning. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Eleanor.
Thank you, Becky. I really appreciate that. I want to thank all of my colleagues on this panel because they did 2 wonderful things. They stuck to time. So I was so, you know, when you're the last speaker, you get nervous that you're not going to have much time left, but they were wonderful about the time schedule. And they were also wonderful about fabulous content. I saw so many places where there's an intersection with all of the things that we're talking about here today in the fusion of patient engagement and patient experience data, but also alignment with what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about patient-centered core impact sets and a foundation for alignment, all of the things that we've been talking about today. This is a project that the National Health Council has been working on, as I mentioned earlier, and it's also linked to the work that Neil presented at the beginning from PFMD. So next slide, please. And I think you can also skip this next one. I want to just kind of review a couple of the terms that we've been talking about because this is the way I think of them. So I think of patient centricity as being the goal, and patient centricity means does not mean putting patients at the center of everything that we do. I always laugh about the cliche aspects of that. Patient centricity is really that patients are experts and that they should be partners and leading a lot of the work that we do and have a voice in so much of the work that we do in medical product development, but also in the way that care is delivered and other aspects of the health ecosystem. So that's the goal. Patient centricity is the goal. Patient engagement is the how. It's how we achieve that patient centricity by having patients be engaged in all of the work. And as Teresa mentioned earlier, part of the how is the quality of the how, very important. Patient experience data is what we get out of it. So when we have a patient-centered approach, we've been engaging patients in the process and they are leading the process. In many instances, we get their view of the disease and or the treatments, those impacts and preferences that both Teresa and Becky talked about. And so what I'm going to focus on a little bit more of is impacts. And we define those impacts as the experienced effect of a disease and or treatment on specific aspects of health and daily life, those patient experiences. Next slide, please. So I wanted to lay that groundwork. What Teresa presented was the definition, and I'm not going to review the definition. I just want to point out that there are two central themes here: impacts of that disease or the therapies, and patient preferences. And those preferences can be for attributes that they find, or they can be for things that they want to avoid. So they may experience impacts that they actually think are good and they want to optimize those impacts, or they could experience impacts that they believe are negative and they want to avoid those impacts. And so those are the kinds of things that we're trying to tease apart when we look at patient preferences. And as Becky said, we do that in a couple of ways. We ask patients what's most important to them, where they might rate or rank in some way what's most important to them. But then we also ask them what they're willing to trade off in order to achieve what they want to optimize or to achieve what they want to avoid. Next slide, please. So I'm showing you a very complicated figure, but I'm going to review it with you, and then hopefully you will think it's not quite so complicated once I do that. This, I hope, ties together the things that I was just talking about in the terms and the terminology and what some of my colleagues spoke about previously. So this is our framework for developing disease-specific, patient-centered core impact sets, which we believe will be a tool that can be very useful to all the things that we've been talking about today. The project that we've been working on is not to create the patient-centered core impact sets. It's to create a blueprint so that others will have a standardized guide for how this should be done and how it can be useful to all of those aligned possible uses that you see listed on the right-hand side of this slide. I've also noticed that there's a couple of things that got a little bit blurry in the translation, but that's okay, I can walk you through them. So if we start in the top left-hand corner, you see up there a pool of the potentially important impacts that patients might report. So they could report that things like mortality and survival, symptoms, signs, biomarkers, aspects of function, their impact on others in their family, in their lives, their well-being, their quality of life, their treatment experience, how resources get used, out-of-pocket costs, things like that, and then what they experience in the health system. And again, as we said, preferences of how those things get weighted, how they get prioritized and weighted are very important. Below those bubbles that I just listed off are important considerations. So these are not impacts, but these are certainly things that affect impacts. Things like equity, representativeness, social determinants of health, health literacy and numeracy, culture, religion, a person's basic demographic characteristics to start off with. Those are all things that have an effect on how patients experience their disease and their treatments. So a little funnel there in the center as we move to the right just demonstrates that we figure out for a particular disease or a particular patient population, we figure out what's most important to them through family engagement, to patient engagement, to get to what is most important to them, those most important impacts. And you see those in the center. We put them through a prioritization process that also considers what we learn from other stakeholders and what we learn from research that's been done in the past. And we get a larger pool that gets filtered down into the patient-centered core impact set. What I want to point out here is that at the end of that second prioritization process, we need to maintain what patients told us was most important. We can't throw those things out because other things get outweighted that come from other sources. And then in the end, you see to the right, what are the possible uses for all of these things? Well, as was mentioned by my colleagues, those uses should be aligned and can be aligned. Maybe we don't always use the same measures because we need measures that are fit for purpose for different uses. Possibly they need to be different, but at least they would be aligned with one another. And that's the goal. Next slide, please. So the advantages, we want to see something that's patient-centered and patient-driven. So we see patient groups and patient communities driving a lot of this work. We want to see alignment of those impact targets for all the downstream uses. We want to see harmonization of the approaches, and we hope that the blueprint can do that. And then when gaps are identified, and we want that to inform the research agendas and data gathering efforts. In the past, we have seen a lot of instances where because something can't be measured or because it's difficult, then those impacts get thrown out. And we don't want to see that happen. We want to see it be used. Next slide, please. I want to just acknowledge the large group that's been involved with this. I'm not going to list them off, of course, but we've had a very multidisciplinary, multi-collaborative approach to all of this work. And next slide, please. I just want to thank you and to thank my colleagues who spoke before me, because they were able to really set the stage so well. I'm going to turn it over to Haley now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eleanor, Teresa, Becky, and Neil. Wonderful presentations, so much interesting information that you have shared, but with, of course, that common theme of the patient engagement and patient experience data fusion running through all of it. We've kept on time, which is terrific. So thank you as well to all of the presenters for that. We have a few minutes now for the Q&A. We've received some questions through the Zoom Q&A function and also in the chat. I know there was a couple of questions that were raised that a couple of the panelists suggested that we address live as well too. So perhaps I can start with one of the first questions, and that's really thinking about, as Becky had suggested, that patient preference studies or patient preference information, excuse me, is just one type of patient experience data. And so when we're thinking about patient experience data and all of the different methods and tools that are available to be used to measure that, how do we evaluate the type and the quality of the data that will actually be both respected and valuable to non-patient stakeholders? So for example, to funders, the insurers, researchers, and to industry as well too. So that, I think, is sort of an overriding question there. I'll put that out to the panel and see, first of all, perhaps Teresa, is that a question that you might be able to address, and specifically related to one question that was raised about, would the FDA be interested in output from patient advisory board meetings as an adjunct to the clinical study reports? So Teresa, perhaps we can start off with your initial thoughts there, and I'll turn to the other speakers as well.
Thank you, Haley. So I'm going to start it sounded to me like two different questions. So I'm going to actually go with the patient preference question. I'm unfamiliar with the kind of advisory report. Maybe I'll hear more about that in the discussion. But some of the factors we look at with patient preference studies, and admittedly, FDA has not seen as many of them as we have, we receive patient-reported outcome measures. But we're going to look at, whether they include and present to patients, in a balanced and unbiased way, all the relevant benefits and risks that are posed for a particular drug, if it's in the context of a drug development program, of whether the cognitive burden of the judgment of those trade-off tasks, which are not simple tasks, and you hope that you wonder if the patient is familiar enough with the meaning of the way the questions are posed, the risks that are being posed, and the way the benefits are being described, and if there's any uncertainty around these possible futures. Preference population study, who's in the study of the preferences versus the indicated population that would be receiving this product, just a variety of factors affecting the validity and the reliability that we'd need to ask, and making sure patients really understood sort of the questions being posed and weren't being asked to perform tasks that are challenging. People cooperate and tend to answer questions, and even whether or not they may feel they fully understand them sometimes. And so we know that that's also a concern. So anyway, I'll stop there, but this is the kind of thing that we'll look at to make sure we understand what this data represents. Over.
Haley, I want to jump in on that one also, because Teresa said something that's really important. And if you take a look at health literacy and health numeracy, you find that very often patients don't understand the questions that they're being asked, and they don't understand the response choices that they've been given. I think we've done an excellent job of trying to address that issue when it comes to the development of patient-reported outcomes, and there are methodological techniques that are used to help examine those issues to try to get it right. We're not always successful, but at least with the COA world, we're doing a good job of attempting to address it. We have to do as good a job in other aspects of care too, with preference questions and just informing patients in general about their choices and options in care. And what we're finding is that patients will sit there and answer a question because they don't want to admit that they don't understand the question. And so they will simply select an answer. And that's certainly not what we want to base decision-making on. We want to be sure that patients do understand the question, and that's vitally important in preference assessment.
Thank you, Eleanor and Teresa, for that. I was just going to ask Becky, do you want to jump in and just acknowledge some of the work that IMI has been doing as well?
Well, absolutely. And what I would like to do is build on Teresa and Eleanor's, comments and echo some of the things that they've said. One of the purposes of Prefer was to really develop and advance the science of patient preference information. So to really help us develop and understand how we develop high quality, representative, valid, reliable, literacy appropriate preference information. And so these have been areas of intense focus and research and development for the past 5 years. And we feel that through the qualification and through some of the less well-known, perhaps, work streams that have focused on some of the psychological aspects of the development and use of preference information, that we've reached a place where we know how we can develop high quality, valid and reliable information that's also patient-centric and patient appropriate. That's not to say that there's not more work that needs to be done. As Teresa mentioned in her presentation, there will be a guidance forthcoming from the FDA, from CEDAR, around approximately 2026, I think is when it might be expected. There already has been guidance developed by CDRH, but obviously CDRH and CEDAR guidance will be very important, to helping set regulatory expectations. So there's a great deal of additional work, that needs to be done. But we certainly feel like we're in a much more informed place than where we were, say 5 to 7 years ago.
Terrific. Thanks, Becky. And just to clarify for people as well, too, who may not be familiar with CDRH and CEDAR, CDRH and CEDAR are both divisions from within the FDA. CDRH focusing specifically on drugs and, CDRH, Becky, you can jump in there.
Radiological health.
Thank you. Radiological
Center
health
for
devices.
Devices. Sorry, folks. Yeah, I forgot about the acronyms.
Devices and radiological health.
Yep, devices and CEDAR, Teresa's division, focuses on drugs.
Terrific. Thanks, Becky. Neil, I see you have your hand raised. A comment?
Yeah, just because listening to this, it's easy to think about patient experience data as this new shiny thing that we have here that we're grappling with, and there's an element of truth to that because some of these methodologies are quite new. I just want to point out that in the HTA world, HTA bodies ask patient groups for evidence in many countries, not all, and they provide that evidence through surveys, through interviews. That is also patient experience data. That is also an input into decision-making processes that we've had for well over 10 years, maybe even 20 years in some countries now. And so there's different kinds of patient experience data used in decision-making processes. And it's not just at this sort of, if you like, the top end of these really new methodologies like patient preference studies, but it's also thinking about that body of evidence that already exists, that has been generated by the patient community into other decision-making processes. I wouldn't want us to forget that.
Neil, I want to add to that too, because I think in the US, that is relatively new. We don't have as long a standing history of incorporating patient experience data into some of the work that's done in what's in the US is called value assessment rather than health technology assessment. But essentially, we're talking about the same thing. We have seen an improvement in that over the last 5 years. I think there's still a long way to go with the quality of the work. As Teresa mentioned earlier, quality is always going to be very important here. And that's why I think one of the things that what I was trying to emphasize is that if we could have alignment in figuring out what's important to patients, and that becomes available across the board, open source, then it can be tapped into by value assessors, HTA assessors, people who do quality of care assessment, as well as people who work on clinical trials and medical product development. And they would all be looking at the same targets rather than a measure developed here, a measure developed there, endpoints used here, endpoints used there, without them really being tied together in one way. And I think the work in health technology assessment and value assessment is one of the areas that's really made this a flashing red light of why we need to do this better.
Can I add to that a little bit too? Because I think that, and I'm looking at one of the questions in the chat from someone at UCB. I mean, I think that tying the collection of this information to the empowerment of patients is quite direct to me. I mean, you know what they say about performance is what's measured is what people are going to pay attention to. So exactly. I think that, and I think to me, one of the reasons that FDA also, I mean, obviously, you know, we agree with LRA and NHC on the standard core sets, because if we could have what mattered to the patients being well measured, and in fact, let's just say incorporate that into the data collected, not just during trials, but you know, people talk about the learning healthcare system. Let's try to start pulling this stuff into medical records. I mean, if we started collecting this information and continued to collect it, I think we'd both be able to make better use of, you know, clinical healthcare data, electronic medical record data as a source of real world evidence, for example. But I mean, let's pull the patient perspective into that as well. And I think then you can get it into downstream use, even beyond the reimbursement, beyond HTA, but further downstream than that. So I think measuring it can also empower, although it's not the only opportunity for sure.
And you can't change and improve what you can't measure. And we have to get to that point where we're doing a good job of all of that. And I think one of the reasons why we've been emphasizing that if it comes to the development of a patient-centered core impact set, we really want to see patient communities leading that, because we want to see the information in a centralized place that perhaps a patient group could put on their website, that everyone could go to get that information and feed additional information. This is going to be a growing, living, evolving source of information. It's never going to be stagnant, because we need more information from more patients, more representativeness, diversity. You can only start to collect that over time with larger numbers across regions, and impacts won't be the same. We don't know that they'll necessarily be of the same value in different regions of the world. We have to learn that.
Thank you, Eleanor, Teresa, Neil, and Becky, for the comments and the insights that you've shared, obviously, through this Q&A. I think some of the overriding core messages and themes that I'm hearing from all of you is obviously in terms of looking at ways to help empower and really to provide additional opportunities for the patient community to be able to share and express what is most meaningful and most impactful for them, and how that can be measured and harmonized across a number of different stakeholders, so that there is that increase in efficiencies within the healthcare system, and also helping to decrease the burden on patients and caregivers as well too, as we're trying to better understand this. There are a number of other questions that have been raised in not only in the chat, but also in the Q&A. And so I would encourage our panelists, to the extent that you feel comfortable responding to some of those questions, please feel free to do so in the chat or in the Q&A in written form. Otherwise, for those questions that we're not able to address during the meeting now, then we'll certainly do our best to respond and get back to you as well. But for now, in our remaining time, I'd like to turn back over now to the opportunity to do some more insight gathering, specifically from our audience and from the participants in the call. So we will revert back to the group map. And as you'll remember, that for those of you that have joined recently, if the link for the group map is back in the chat, you click on the link, follow it through, and enter your email address. And as is displayed on the screen, this is what you should see. So we can again see, in terms of the representation of stakeholders, obviously a number from industry and also from the patient community as well too, which is terrific. We have some representation from researchers and from the regulatory focus as well. Our first question today, as we move to the first question here. Thank you. And so everybody should see this on their screen now. Is following the conversation that we've had here today, obviously hearing from Teresa, Becky, Eleanor, and Neil as representatives of different stakeholder groups, where do you see, as a representative of a specific stakeholder group, where do you see the value in patient engagement combined with patient experience data? So thinking about your own stakeholder group, specifically, but then if you also have some insights to share as to what could be the value for other stakeholder groups as well too, we'd be interested in seeing that. You can see where the little plus sign is, that you can move your cursor and enter some information there, as others are starting to do here now. So we'll just give everybody a moment to think that through. If you're having any technological issues or questions, please feel free to reach out in the chat and we'll do our best to support you. And just give people a moment. There's a reminder here as well that, as you can see with under the patient community stakeholder group, you'll see that you'll be able to scroll up and down to see further responses that have dropped below where the list is. And you can also click on a particular item and give it a thumbs up as well too. Terrific. Thank you for the demo there. So seeing some of the responses that are coming in here too, looking, maybe if we start with the patient community, and if Eleanor, if you've had a chance to reflect on a little bit of some of the responses and in line with how it may be represented from the presentation that you gave in terms of looking at better treatment plans, access to new medications. Do you see? Yeah, I mean,
go
ahead.
As I said earlier, you can't do anything. You can't collect the patient experience data without engaging patients. That has to have happened at some point. So maybe you don't have to do it yourself, as I said in one of the responses, but you do have to know that the data originated with patients in some way, that someone did a good job of collecting that information, if it's yourself or someone else. So you had to have conducted good quality patient engagement in order to get the patient engagement data that you need to inform any of these things. And as Teresa mentioned, we are just beginning to address where that information comes from. There are sources out there like a Voice of the Patient report. It's always a very good place to start. It really can guide a next step for someone. If they begin with a Voice of the Patient report, they can figure out, what does their focus group look like? What does their interview process look like? Where do those interview guides come from in terms of originating the content? That could come from a Voice of the Patient report, all the way through to a larger scale data collection, such as surveys, or what we might incorporate into registries, into clinical trial data collection, into care collection in electronic medical records. We are not there with any of those things, but if we do a better job of that, then we can in turn improve those services and processes.
Great.
And you see that all across here, addressing unmet needs.
Exactly.
It's across the board.
Yeah. And so it's interesting to see exactly some of the commonalities and some of that common ground that the stakeholders, again, from various different stakeholder groups, the representatives there are expressing as well too. Neil, how about your comments in terms of from an HTA perspective? Just wondering if you've had a chance to see some of the comments coming in there and sort of from a value assessment as well.
Exactly. I think it's what Eleanor was saying, is those two things have to be together. And we've sort of had them together within HTA, but I think as we get more and more patient experience data, we broaden that evidence base. And we also make it more, potentially covers more diversity, more representation, because you can go to more people. Now, typical HTA committee meeting, you might have 1 or 2 patient groups represented and 1 or 2 expert patients, if they have a patient engagement process. And those patient groups come armed with evidence that they've collected themselves. So they come with their own patient experience data to back up the comments they're going to make in that committee meeting. But as we have a new layer of patient experience data that sits alongside that, that really supports that, then I think it strengthens the argumentation. It strengthens the voice of the patient in those kinds of decision-making meetings.
Wonderful. Thanks, Neil. And Teresa, from a regulatory standpoint, in terms of complementing what Neil has suggested or seeing some reflections in terms of the comments underneath the regulatory box there?
Yes, they are.
I've been trying to read them. It's been challenging. I mean, absolutely, we need to kind of, if we can have, I just would echo what's already been said. I mean, trying to make sure that the quality is there, and just something is well constructed, and it's going to be serviceable for decisions. And then, the more we can go there, the more we're going to be able to use this kind of information.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I'm just noticing before we move on to the next question as well too, but one area that we haven't really touched on is looking at healthcare professionals and in terms of the use of patient experience data and patient engagement within a clinical practice as well too. So as obviously a number of thumbs up here for looking at holistic patient-centric documentation of benefit risk. Becky, I'm not sure if you want to add any further comments there, or just reflecting on some of what the healthcare professionals and some of the opportunities there in terms of the value for PE and PED.
Sure. Reflecting back to actually something that Neil said at the beginning of his presentation, and that is the danger of repetition and or even fragmentation. And I think that what strikes me as I look at what I can see from my screenshot is the siloing of these categories and maybe but yet the continuity and the overlap of the comments. So as we move forward, I think we need to focus even more on connecting, on connectivity, because we've spent a great deal of time according to our backgrounds and expertise. We're focusing on developing the science, for example, of patient preferences, or we've been focused on regulatory development or industry development. But as we move forward, what we need to really take stock of and pay even more attention to is how we increase the connectivity among these groups. So that we're developing, we're using our talents and our expertise, but yet we're working toward a shared goal, under a rubric of harmonization.
Absolutely, Becky. And I think that's a great summary there, that while we've asked for stakeholder representatives here in terms of where they would find value, it's looking at what is the common thread there? Where is that collective value for PE and PED, and where can we find that common ground to help move it forward? So I thank everybody for their input into this. This first question. We have two more questions that we'd love to have your input in. And while we've addressed here in terms of where is the value, what opportunities are there, we'd like to also consider if we can see that there is the potential there for new opportunities, there is some value for PE and PED fusion and working together with other stakeholders. What are some of the barriers that you're currently facing in terms of integrating patient engagement into patient experience data? So really thinking about what's blocking and what's resisting in terms of having patient engagement involved with the patient experience data for evidence design and for generation as well too. So we'll give people just a minute or two to provide some input there.
Haley, I just wanted to comment on something with regard to barriers. The National Health Council about 6 years ago, maybe almost 7 years ago now, actually had talked about this in a workshop that we had about was with regard to regulatory issues, but I think a lot of it is still prominent today. That workshop came to the conclusion that there were 3 general barriers. One of them was cultural barriers, overcoming resistance to wanting to do things a new way. Another was guidance barriers, regulatory guidance or regulatory guidelines on how this could be done. And then the third was communication and making sure that all the stakeholders were communicating within their own sphere, but also with one another. I think we've made a lot of headway on the cultural barrier. There's still more to go. I think we've made a lot of headway on the regulatory guardrail barrier. I think with the guidance documents that FDA is putting together, that we've made some significant headway there. I think we probably could do better with communications still. So there's still work to be done, but we've accomplished quite a lot in the last 6 to 7 years since those were the top list of barriers that we were talking about back then.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eleanor, for that perspective as well, too. And I really like the way that, as you said, in terms of the work that was done previously, how those barriers or those concerns were grouped in that sense. And to your point, in terms of the progress that's been made, certainly as part of the PE and PED project with PFMD and the white paper that was put out last fall, which really was to try and demonstrate and illustrate this increasing consideration of PE and PED by the regulatory and HTA bodies. But the progress that's being made, that there is information, there are open consultations, there's more guidances coming out, whether that be from the FDA or on a global and an international level as well too. So certainly some progress being made there as well. And maybe in light of that too, because I know there was one question previously, recognizing that some of the comments and information that was shared here was specific to the FDA. But Teresa, perhaps just while people are continuing to consider some of these barriers, do you want to just speak to a minute about some of the opportunities that are going on at an international level in terms of some of this work as well, outside of the great work of the FDA and how you're involved?
Sure, Haley. And I'm just noting, and I think some of the comments we're seeing here too really reflect some of the things, survey fatigue with multiple exclamation points. What speaks to this need to, to the extent we can capture it and put it somewhere that others can make use of what's already been done, maybe pre-competitively or something. But I believe you're referring to, and I think it's even relevant to the previous discussion, which at the end of the day, a lot of the groups that come to FDA are essentially motivated because there isn't any good treatment for their disease. Okay, there's just nothing much there. I mean, there may be no approved treatment for their condition or their child's condition, and it's a very bad disease. It may be progressive and degenerative disease, and so they want action as soon as possible. And so drug development is very important. Some of those earlier comments, in fact, I saw industry better endpoints. I mean, my goodness, if you don't have well-defined endpoints, kind of forget it. I mean, you got to be able to show that the drug works. I'll talk about drugs. And if you haven't got a well-defined endpoint, you're just that much further from being able to provide the evidence. I mean, it's not the only problem, but it's common one, okay? And if you can't show that evidence, then you're not going to get reimbursement. So there's all these things are connected, right? And so ICH, the International Council on Harmonization, which has a much longer name, which I'm not going to give you, but that's the short name, ICH, we've basically got I'm very active in ICH as a representative from the US FDA. And we have a so-called reflection paper on patient-focused drug development. Reflection paper, ICH uses those to basically put forward ideas for future guideline work and kind of strategic, maybe more than one guideline in an area to address need. And in this case, the patient-focused drug development paper, which is available, it's on the ICH website. When you come to the landing page, it's not hard to find the reflection papers and take a look at it. It describes a range of opportunities, as we've been talking about today, and in particular identifies two areas for guideline work. And one is around kind of collecting this information in trials, as I mentioned earlier, in the form of, say, clinical outcome assessments and measures, and how to structure those well, again, to have good quality. And the second area of work that's put forward as a particular opportunity is in the area of methods for preference, understanding patient preferences, the kind of work that Becky's been talking about. Another area where if we had harmonized guidelines, it would really better support drug development, which tends to be multi-regional, of course. And also we want patients' perspectives from all those regions to be pulled in and informing drug development. So over.
Absolutely. Thank you, Teresa, for that overview. I think it's important for everybody to recognize that there's a number of initiatives that are moving forward. And as Eleanor was suggesting, that from regulatory guidance, that things are progressing, and perhaps it's an area that in terms of the communication, we can help to support in terms of making sure that that the information is getting to the correct stakeholders, that patients are familiar with that, it's not just the patient organizations, but beyond that, again, we're seeing a lot of comments in the chat and the Q&A about patient engagement and how we can further make that available to those that may not already be tapped into opportunities as well too. So
can I add one thing to that I think is really important about
absolutely
are being brought up in some of the comments here.
Yeah.
The regulatory guidance that's coming out doesn't just help us with what happens in clinical trials and product approval. It helps us in terms of legitimacy, and it helps us to overcome some of those cultural barriers. I have actually seen people who are from payer organizations who in the past have kind of blown off, oh, patient engagement, that's not very important to us. But when you say, but the FDA cares about this, and here's what they're doing, and here are the regulatory guidance documents that are out and that are being developed. This is what the FDA is looking at. It's what they're putting within their organization and processes. Other groups, other stakeholders stop and pay attention when you say that it's now part of the regulatory consideration and there's guidance documents. So I do think it helps us beyond regulatory. It helps us with that spanning those cultural acceptance and cultural acceptance and discussion.
Yeah, excellent point, Eleanor. Thank you for sharing that as well too. I think it really drives home that message that as many people have commented on too, just looking for not only the guidance, but as you suggested, the legitimacy of ensuring that the patient's voice is really heard, and what is really important and what matters to patients is being incorporated into a lot of the work that's being done here as well. In the interest of time, I'm going to go on to the last question. So we've talked in terms of some of the values and the opportunities for patient engagement and patient experience data fusion. We've identified some of the barriers and some of the potential obstacles as to why it's more challenging to integrate patient engagement into patient experience data. And so with that in mind, we ask you to take some time to reflect on if there was opportunity to develop and further introduce supports, tools, resources. What would your stakeholder group recommend or identify that there's a need for in terms of the use and also implementing patient engagement and patient experience data? How do we provide supports, resources, tools that could be able to see I think we're laughing at the same one. The cash, I'm surprised there's not 7 or so exclamation marks after that one as well too. So recognizing, of course, in terms of some of resources that are available as well too. Looking from industry's perspective, the regulatory expectations, as we've talked about as well, education and training, some time. In terms of, we've heard Teresa and Eleanor, some of your comments in terms of some of the opportunities here. I'd be interested to hear from Becky and from Neil in terms of some of the comments that may have been input in the last question, but also in this one in terms of, from your perspective. Maybe I can turn to Becky first in terms of looking at the tools and the resources, what's most important, and then we'll hear from Neil. And in the interest of time, we'll have to move along quite quickly.
Sure, I think I can tie maybe some threads from the last question and this question together and sort of focus on just a few answers. And the first would be one that Teresa mentioned about a pre-competitive space, right? And going back to the answer around survey fatigue, there is no need for Roche and Novartis and Lilly and Janssen. If we're developing a rheumatoid arthritis drug, each of those companies don't need to go to the arthritis community and ask the same questions over again. So as we develop these understandings of what patients want, we need a place where we can share those results so that others can see them and reuse them, if and as appropriate. So we need to start thinking about a way in which we can encourage companies to come together in a pre-competitive way to share their patient experience and their patient preference information. That's one thread I wanted to pull on. The second one that I want to pull on is in the patient community chat, a focus. I saw templates earlier, a mention of templates and this education and training. And as I mentioned in my presentation, there are multiple work streams within Prefer, but we did have one very important work stream that focused on psychological constructs. So helping patients develop, use, understand patient preference information. So as well as templates and education and training. We also had an operational work stream within Prefer. And so as part of that, we've developed a series of webinars around using and understanding patient preference information. So first of all, you can go to the Prefer website. You can find a host of information about preferences, but if you go to the Prefer website, the main landing page, it can direct you towards our webinars, which are available on YouTube on various aspects of patient preference information and patient preference studies. And as Haley learned, saying patient preference multiple times can be a bit of a tongue twister. But certainly we have a series of webinars. We also, for industry, for other companies who may wish to do preference studies, have a series of operational guidances around best practices, as well as templates that they can use. So I think there are across the chat, we've seen, reference to multiple things that we need to maybe do an even better job at communicating around resources that are currently available for all of these stakeholder groups to use.
Fabulous. Thank you, Becky. And certainly we will make sure that we share that, that link as well to the Prefer website as well. As we switch back to the slides, because I see we just have a couple of minutes left, but Neil, I just want to give you sort of a last word or a comment to make in terms of the reflections from the group map exercise as well.
Very, very briefly, from a HTA perspective, I think that there's two parallel things and a watch out. The two parallel things that I think we need to be doing is within the HTA community is sharing good practices. So the whole HTA community gets better understanding how to use this kind of evidence. but they also need to be networked closer to the regulators, to the other stakeholders, so we're not doing this in silos. Those two things need to happen in parallel. The big challenge is HTA bodies are publicly taxpayer-funded bodies. They have finite resources, and we keep asking them to do more and more and get and change in different ways. And so we need to also be having a sensible conversation within our countries about how we expand resources so that all these things can happen. And we often don't have that discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Neil. I really appreciate the final comments there. What we've heard, obviously, is a lot of keen interest to make sure that the patient voice is heard, that the patient experiences that are most meaningful and most impactful and most important to the patients, to the family members, to the caregivers is absolutely fundamental to moving forward with patient experience data. As Eleanor said right from the very beginning, that you cannot have patient experience data without patient engagement. There's been a number of questions. We could obviously continue this webinar on for a long time, lots of really interesting information, but in the essence of time here, then we will just I'd just like to extend a huge thank you to our panelists, Neil, Eleanor, Rebecca, and Teresa. Thank you so much for your contributions to a really important conversation, and one that we will continue to have, obviously, in the work with PFMD and with others as well, too, as we progress in providing some more clarity, some structure, and streamlining and harmonizing how stakeholders are working together here. So thank you very much to all of you for your contributions. Thank you to the audience and the participants for your input into the group map. We will be following up in terms of providing the slides as appropriate and of recording as well too, in terms of having that accessible. So please keep an eye on your inbox. On the next slide as well, you'll see that we will be sending out a survey. If you have a moment just to complete this really quickly, it will really help us to provide some additional insights for future sessions and some feedback. And for those of you who are not yet registered, I encourage you to consider 2 other open forum sessions on Thursday, one looking at remuneration, and the second one as well too, in terms of looking at translational research and the new normal with patient engagement as well. So thank you very much, everybody, for your contributions, and we look forward to your participation in a future open forum session. Thank you very much.